Hello, beautiful micro community. I'm often asked, how do you tell apart a Russian artist or a Russian work of art from a Ukrainian artist or a Ukrainian work of art? And what we're going to do here on the Philosophy channel is a bit of escalation. Not the kind of escalation you're used to me talking about on the main channel or on the chat channel, which is the escalation of the brutal tyrant in the Kremlin. Here we'll do a more benign escalation. We'll escalate difficulty and clarity and keep one foot in a public intellectual camp, whereby you come first in any conversation, but we'll take one foot and put it in a philosophical conversation camp, whereby you don't come first, but the ideas do. That's very different to the mode we operate in on chat and on the main channel. So I'll try to keep you on board as much as possible and make you feel deeply welcome, but this will not be a conversation that will completely put you first. I've got to be honest about that. There will be some concepts and some names that might fly past, and that might be a kind of illumination or a kind of a fireworks of unbearable boredom. The way we'll have this conversation is without mentioning Russia or Ukraine a single time, which means that there is another kind of conversation to be had that could be had separately. This will be a conversation that gives us a bit of clarity, which is to say philosophical clarity, which is to say just clarity, about how far national characteristics can be spoken about when it comes to understanding the work of an artist. And national characteristics in this chat is just going to be a shorthand for not just national characteristics, but other group characteristics, cultural characteristics that bring together, if you like, geography and culture beyond just a nation. So we could even be talking about the characteristics of a city, right? Let's go. I'm going to take a quick sip of coffee and then we'll start. I've made a note of 5 or 6 keywords that'll mean that we have a very loose structure within which we'll have a spontaneous chat. We're going to start with injustice. Just because it's ethical, given the political context we're in, even if we don't mention Russia or Ukraine, it's ethical to start with injustice. So how can art production suffer injustice? There are 2 ways. A work of art because of injustice might not be made. Number 1, because the group that is on the wrong end of an injustice doesn't even get the chance to make its art, right? Or a work of art might be made but not seen because there are not collective interpretive resources to grasp what it's about, because of the amount of prejudice against the group that's produced the work, right? Or against the type of work that it is. So a work of art might not be made because of an injustice, or it might not be seen. So let's say a bit about not made. I'm going to get a very small arrow. I do not like throwing arrows, but I've got a very small arrow. Just going to throw it right now. Boom! Where have I thrown this arrow? I've thrown the arrow at some of the literature in... I had many targets in mind, I'll just pick one. Some of the literature in ethnomusicology of the last few decades. Don't worry, we're not going to get into the weeds here. And some ethnomusicological writings have argued that the real problem is that we have failed to recognize how many great female composers there have been in the past, because classical music, don't worry, we'll have other art form examples, classical music is a white man's enterprise. This argument obviously contains some truth, but it is mainly false. Why is it false? Surely it's making some kind of a, adequate, promising, valorous feminist point. So what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it is that it's not feminist enough. Not feminist enough. If Beethoven in 1770 is born with a huge, this is very difficult because I can't pronounce the word H in English, horn, with a huge horn on his head, he makes it. He makes it as a composer. This guy has a giant horn on his head. But is he revolutionizing the musical language he has inherited from Mozart and Haydn? Yes. Screw the horn. We'll cope with the horn. If Beethoven is born a woman, however, I'd fancy his chances of making a successful career would be less than if he had a horn. So therefore, we're in the realm of saying that in 1770, the trouble isn't that women were allowed to compose music, and we've just disregarded its quality. The main story here, this is more complicated than I'm making it up, but the main story is preponderantly women were not allowed to develop their talent, therefore art didn't get made. Now there is a second possibility, that it does get made, but it isn't seen, right? Interpretive resources are lacking, prejudice is abundant in the air, it's not seen. And I've written a line here, I think it's just what I've said. So we don't see the art production of a particular culture because we don't have the interpretive resources to see it, or because there is too much prejudice in the air. This form of art production is on the wrong end of a kind of epistemic or even a hermeneutical injustice, to borrow two concepts from lovely, wonderful colleague Miranda Fricker. Now, the same structure of a problem can manifest in a context apart from a culture being disregarded in its contribution, right? Let's take a few examples. The cartoons of Gary Larson could be argued to be works of art, or important aesthetic objects at least, but it is so difficult for us to even entertain the possibility that a cartoon with a little picture and a line could be a work of art that we don't have the resources, or really the momentum, probably have the resources, to bring it about that we have an adequate cultural conversation about how these things might in fact be remarkable. Right? Or take Luis Buñuel's film The Phantom of Liberty. Right? It's a very important surrealist work of art. But it's hard for us to imagine that surrealism is most compellingly expressed in film as opposed to in painting, something we can see in a gallery. So the idea that the best work of surrealist art ever made could be a film is strange to us, and we might not adequately attend to it. Last example. You see, these are benign examples, but the structure of the problem is absolutely the same as it is in the case of artists from a certain culture that is in many ways disempowered. There's a young woman in Switzerland called Viviane Chasson. She is one of the 20 most gifted musicians alive. But she plays the accordion. She plays Haydn, Bach, Mozart on the accordion. Right? There's going to be a problem, integrating an understanding of how lovely her musical contribution is because of the instrument she plays. We've done injustice. Let's get into the real conversation. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to schematically say it. So here's what I'm going to say. With good quality art, and we'll see there is also bad quality art and not art. With good quality art, judgment about its national characteristics or absence thereof has to be constitutive. That's to say, it has to be internal to the work of art. Right? If a painter is British or a Londoner or let us even say from Cornwall, right? That is not something you could figure out by going to Wikipedia and looking at the geographical locations of the artist, where they were born, where they lived, and so on. You're going to have to find that, or find its absence, in the work itself. That's what I'm going to say. If you're going to talk about the national characteristics of good or great art, you're going to find them or fail to find them only constitutively. They're going to be internal to the work. Right? That's very, very important. So let's get on with it. Our first section. There are three art situations. There is a situation where something is good art. There is a situation where something is art but not good art, it's average or bad art. And then there is a situation where something is not art. This is not an analytical ivory tower exercise. This is a set of distinctions that are about capturing a human practice as it occurs in the real world. So how does this work? Much of what I'll say will be continuous with a beautiful man called Richard Volheim, who died in 2003. And the thing I'm about to say next will sound very like Richard. In fact, it's just Richard's view. Art requires three pillars to be in place. Number one, a psychological state. Which we could call an intention. When we talk about intention in the everyday sense of the word, we often think of something conscious. I intend to cross the road, and then I cross the road. In art production, we see intention as unconscious, right? When I look at a Beethoven score, or for that matter, at a Picasso painting, I am saying this is what the work intends, or what the artist intends. There may be a difference between the two, but I'll avoid this issue for now. But this is what the artist, the work intends. But it's not just possible, but necessary that that intention is unconscious when it comes to good or great art production. Are there going to be exceptions to what I've said? Yes. So there is the psychological state, number one, which we tie with the concept of intent. Second comes the transference of this, right, onto the particular mode of art production. So that internal state is transferred onto marks on the canvas, or marks on the page if you're writing a musical composition, or something else. That's the second component, right? The transference via, right, an application of physical marks or something like that, the transference of that onto the page, onto the canvas, onto whatever. A physical mass of a certain kind in sculpture and so on. And the third component is that an initiated audience can receive this intention, right? Articulated via a particular mode of expression, right? So there's a psychological state, there is the transference of that state onto the particular mode, via the particular mode of expression, right? Onto a canvas, onto a page, and so on. And then there is an audience that receives it. These are the three components. And what carries this whole thing through is the successful realization of an intention. So we're not talking about intention, we're talking about intention successfully realized that allows the thing to go all the way through, allows for the psychological state, right, to be transferred onto, for example, marks on the canvas, that then allows marks on the canvas to be transferred, if you like, into the mind of an audience that's receptive, and that audience receives the intent. What's less good art? Less good art is when this process still succeeds, but it's a low quality one. It's a shit successful intention. It's a shit realized intention. So that means there is a psychological state, right? There is the realization of it, right? Via a particular mode of applying marks on the canvas, for example. And then that is received by the audience. So the only difference between good art and average or bad art is the quality of the psychological state, right? And the quality of the transference of that state onto whatever it is being transferred to, which depends on the mode of the art production that's at hand. But what is not art? And I've written not art here as a category, but in fact it must be two categories. Not art is all kinds of stuff that might have great aesthetic value but doesn't even intend to be a work of art. And there is then not art, whereby the now I'm talking about a different kind of intent, a conscious intent, and then there is a situation where the artist, the wannabe artist, intends for what they make to be art, but it isn't, right? So what is the paradigm of something that's not art? The paradigm of something that's not art is a child's drawing. And why is it not art? It's not art because there is a lack of control in that step between the psychological state and what is put on the page, on the paper, on the canvas. When you ask a child, why is the sun you have drawn purple? So your sun is purple, it's very beautiful, why is it? And they might say, it's cause my shoes are purple and that's nice. And you might say, wow, that is amazing. So the shoes and the sun, and they're the same. And they said, it's an awesome color, isn't it? It's an arbitrary choice, right? So obviously a child is not going to be in control, right, of everything that is on the paper, on the canvas. An artist is, right? So what makes something a work of art, whether it's a good or a bad work of art, is that whatever you see on the canvas or whatever you see on the page in a novel, or whatever you see on the page if it's musical notes and so on, that all of it is under control. It might be unconscious control, but it's under control. It's not just arbitrary. It's not just that way because it is that way, right? So an artist will ensure that there is some kind of significance to each thing that you see, right? The sky is not going to be dark blue as opposed to light blue because it just is. If it just is, it's not art. It's a very nice drawing, perhaps. It might have some aesthetic value, but it's not art. However, it might be that everything is in this way under the control of the artist, but it's not that great. I mean, yes, there's a special reason why the sky is dark blue and not light blue, but it doesn't make this good, right? So, as much as we've not got all the clarity we want here, we'll let this be now. So we've talked about art that's good, art that's not good, and stuff that's not art. There are two distinctions here. We've just given you one. Not art that strives to be art. There's plenty of, for example, entertainment, right? Movies, songs that are not striving to be art, but actually have aesthetic value. And this is a very important point. The best entertainment that doesn't strive to be art is far more aesthetically rich than the vast majority of art, because the vast majority of art is bad, right? So if we call a certain song not art, but we call it an amazing song, right? It will often be the case that it gives us more, right? It's more rich, it's more deep, it's more moving than the majority of the art that's made, right? So just because something is art does not make it a richer aesthetic object than something that isn't art, right? Okay. Having put this on the table, I want us to focus on the category of good or great art. So we're putting aside not art. So that's to say we're putting aside not art that intends to be art or doesn't intend to be art. And we're putting aside bad art or average art. So what we want to say now is sociological. We want to say something sociological about what constitutes, how have I put this here? What constitutes convergence, right? And the phenomena of convergence on what is and what isn't a great work of art. Like, do we know what is or what isn't a great work of art? Do we agree about it? How far do we agree about it? Let's just say a couple of words about this for now. We're getting shortly to national characteristics. So this is just going to be sociology. There is a distinction between knowledge and public knowledge that's important. That's to say, if you're looking at the resident culture writer in The Guardian or The New York Times, very often their understanding of what constitutes great or not great art will be very poor and will not represent a consensus, right? Somebody who's writing about culture for The New York Times might well think that the Moonlight Sonata is Beethoven's best sonata. Or they might think that, I don't know, Chagall is a great painter. But what happens if we move from the cultural writer for the New York Times to important art critics? So that's to say, let's say we're looking at the greatest art critics of the 20th century, whether it be David Sylvester or Robert Hughes. Let's say we're looking at professional musicologists who have written books about Beethoven and Mozart and so on. How do they rank their works? Do they agree? Do they disagree? And so on. So even if at the level of reading The Guardian and the New York Times, that level of public knowledge, there isn't going to be a consensus. At the level of knowledge that perhaps is contained in a more narrow circle, is there consensus or is there not? This is purely sociological. I'm not saying these people are right. I'm just saying, are they in agreement or not? Let's look at this. In the world of painting, in the serious world of painting, it's going to be hard to find somebody who doesn't think that Picasso is the greatest artist of the 20th century, and who doesn't think that Matisse is second. Right? It is going to be hard to find somebody who doesn't rank Picasso's greatest works as absolutely centrally including La Danse and Demoiselle d'Avignon. There's going to be a consensus about that. Well, what if we move to musicology? Let's say Beethoven's piano sonatas. Is there a consensus? Is there not? If you look at classical music blogs, classical music forums, there's absolutely not a consensus. It's a mix, right? But if you look at the most important critics, writers, and performers who have been articulate about their art, there is consensus. It's not impeccable, but it's there. It could be wrong, but what is it? Well, it's that Beethoven's greatest sonata is the Hammerklavier Sonata Opus 106. The details don't matter. And it's that one of Beethoven's greatest sonatas, probably one of Beethoven's two greatest sonatas, is his last sonata, Opus 111. Right? If you look at the next grouping, then there is going to be more contestation. If we move from top 2 to top 6, there's going to be more contestation. A lot of people, I think the vast majority of people, will include Opus 109, will include the Tempest and the Appassionata, but with more contestation. Many fewer will include what I would include Opus 10 number 3 and early sonata. But this is what I'm telling you. The details don't matter, but the level of convergence is high. There are 32 sonatas, but basically virtually everyone agrees on which 1 and 2 are the best. Right? Let's step out of art for a bit, because this is a ubiquitous, matter of convergence. If you look at serious Nietzsche scholars, right? Philosophical example. Now I'm going to get back into art momentarily. I don't know, I've never met a single professional philosopher who's published extensively on Nietzsche who thinks that Zarathustra is one of Nietzsche's great works. It just isn't. And nobody thinks that it is. Right? The Culture is different, his most famous work. But nobody thinks it's one of his great works. I mean, nobody really thinks that Zarathustra is comparable to Beyond Good and Evil, the genealogy of the gay science. An example of the stability of the kind we're talking at the level of knowledge, at the level of public knowledge, might actually be sport, right? The degree of convergence is really high. And most people think that, the best player in the world of recent years is Messi and the second best is Ronaldo, right? That's quite a stable consensus, right? And people can tell things apart quite easily, right? Almost everyone agrees that Alan Shearer is a better player than Darren Bent. Almost everybody agrees that Hernan Crespo is a less good player than Gabriel Batistuta and so on. So there is a shocking degree of convergence, and that public knowledge convergence in sport is mirrored by the non-public knowledge, just knowledge convergence, and the small group convergence in the arts. Now, there are many exceptions, right? In music, there is great contestation about whether Rachmaninoff is a terrible composer or whether he's a serious composer. There is contestation of a similar kind about Shostakovich, right? But these are exceptions. Finally, let's get to constitutive national characteristics. Remember I told you we're going to be here for 20 minutes? I lied. I'm going to be here for 45. Let's remind ourselves of this key point and then elaborate on it. Either national characteristics are there when we're dealing with a great work of art or a good work of art, or they're not. But whether they are or whether they're not is going to be a product of what is constitutive to the work of art itself. Right? It's not going to be to do with a Wikipedia article entry on what the geographical movements of the artist were. There are several scenarios here. I'm going to race through them quite quickly. One scenario is that the constitutive quality of the art, right, reveals that there's a truth about the relation of this artist's work to national characteristics, and that relation is that there isn't a relation of interest, right? Or that a particular relation that is often attributed is false, whatever else is true, right? So that means that national characteristics in that particular case are unimportant, or a particular sense in which they're applied and said to be important is false, because in that particular sense they are unimportant. So let's take an example. Maybe a silly example. When we talk about American art being American, you often hear the lines, not entirely unjustified, that American art is to a good extent just Europeans reacting to how different America is from Europe and making art on that basis. Right? For example, reacting to the completely unparalleled in the European context, visceral, raw geographical, right, natural expanse of the United States. Right? This extraordinary vastness and rawness of landscape. Well, let's imagine somebody tried to sellotape that to Rothko, Mark Rothko, who, emigrated at a very young age from Eastern Europe. These unbelievable spaces, right, that don't just leave us in awe, but also hold us in them, must be what makes Rothko an American artist, because that is surely a response to the extraordinary geographical expanse of the United States. No, it isn't. It really isn't. As great critic David Sylvester used to say, if there is an analogy of that kind, then what is before us is going to be something like a great cathedral rather than a great landscape that makes us feel tiny in the universe. Right? This is not about us making a situation where we feel tiny in the universe. It's about just what I've said, something that is closer to a spiritual and a religious experience, which doesn't make us feel small in the universe, but makes us feel absolutely part of it. Right? So that analogy of nature doesn't work. And so what does the example tell us? Well, if you wanted to sticky tape Mark Rothko into being an American artist by that move, you're not going to get anywhere. So to that extent, it's a case of national characteristics that are attributed not being there. Right? Not some alternative national characteristic being there to the national characteristic you're pushing, but just the national characteristic you're pushing being absent and nothing else being present instead. Well, we're in London, so let's take a little example that pushes us in the opposite direction. Not long ago, the leading living figurative painter died, Lucian Freud, and you could argue that Lucian was a London artist. Why? Because he was in London? No. Because you see something in his canvases without being shown it that is nevertheless definitely there, and that is London light. Kind of quality of light that I find difficult to describe without using almost negative terms that involve sort of grayness and glare and so on. But nevertheless, it's London light. And so you could say, well, to some extent, that makes it possible to say that, in some sense, he was a London artist, right? So it's an example of us taking something constitutive from the work and then extending from that into a remark about a cultural geographical characteristic. There's an Anselm Kiefer exhibition at the moment in London. And insofar as one thing that Kiefer is repeatedly doing is giving us a kind of extraordinary transparency about what happened in Germany in the middle of the 20th century, to that extent you could talk about various ways in which he is, an artist with a national cultural characteristic. There is then another category, which is constitutively, the work reveals that national characteristics do matter in it, but they are a mix. 3 or 4 different cultures, let's say. Another possibility is that national characteristics really do matter, and we only get one. So somebody's a French artist, let's say. That's constitutively revealed in their work. So we've arrived at a situation where we can point out 2 errors. Attributing a wrong national characteristic when there's a right one to attribute, or a mix to attribute, and misplacing the significance of national characteristics, saying that they don't matter when they do matter in the work of an artist, and saying that they do matter when they don't matter in the work of an artist. Last section worth discussing. It is possible to argue for something I haven't touched upon, which is a kind of not intrinsic but extrinsic sense in which an artist does have a kind of belonging to a place, to a nation, or it could be to a region, to a culture, to a city, and so on. And that's not if that is expressed constitutively, internally in their art production, but if that cultural location, cultural milieu, excelled at grasping, rendering, making culturally transparent, culturally available, the meaning of those works of art. So it might be that Ricky is not a Parisian artist, but that Ricky lived in Paris, but after Ricky's death, all the best interpretations, right? All the best kinds of responses, all the best kinds of elevations of Ricky's work happened in Paris, and that is an extrinsic, a non-intrinsic way in which Ricky is a Parisian artist, you could argue. So let's take an example of this, perhaps the other way around. It's often argued, embarrassingly wrongly, that Schubert is a Viennese artist. And often the argument is made, actually, in this extrinsic sense. Something to do with, well, yes, Schubert said that Vienna was a shithole, that it lacked spirit, it lacked openness. It lacked everything one might want to receive the finest products of human beings, finest aesthetic products. That's more or less what Schubert wrote at the end of his life. But he's a Viennese composer because Vienna, Schubert, Schubert, Vienna over the years. Blah, blah, blah. Well, that common argument is an example of an attribution, right, of this extrinsically sustained national characteristic, national quality to the artist's work, an attribution of that is false. The most Schubertian Vienna has ever been is probably today. Today is when there's the best understanding there's been of Schubert so far. Today, we have Till Fellner, the pianist from there who plays a lot of Schubert. He's a pianist still of the younger generation, born in the early 1970s. But what happens if you look back? Schubert is essentially discovered in the middle of the first part of the 20th century, in the middle of the first half of the 20th century, in the 20s, in Berlin. By a couple of people, and in particular, Arthur Schnabel. Schubert knew his contributions were as great as Beethoven's. But despite that understanding being available, it took a century. Where was Vienna? Well, Schnabel studied in Vienna, but Schnabel's teacher, who was born a couple of years after Schubert's death, had no capacity to understand Schubert. So, no, this is a bullshit story. Alfred Brendel moved to London. Then there's a group of people there, certainly sort of born around 1930, in Vienna, that includes Brendel, Paul Badura-Skoda, and then Jörg Demus, and to a degree Friedrich Gulda. But no, Vienna is not a Schubertian city, I'm sorry, you have Strauss. So that's an example of a situation where we can say, okay, it's not about it being constitutive to the work, but is there a situation whereby the reception of an artist's work is so richly handled in a certain place, possibly the place where they lived, that we can call them an artist of that place, even though their work is not intrinsically revealing of that. It's about the reception of their work that reveals it. Yeah, we could say that. Or we can deny it. And that is, I think, one more way in which it's constructive to talk about a work having or not having national characteristics. Enough. What's the conclusion? The conclusion is you cannot take a great artist, go on Wikipedia, look at where they lived, do a little diagram and figure out where they lived longest and say that's what kind of artist they are. No, it might have been that as a private citizen, but there's an extraordinary gap, and it's one of the most mysterious gaps in the world, between the artist as a private citizen and their art production, right? There's a gap between Beethoven, the author of the string quartets and the Diabelli variations, and Beethoven, the guy who rips the wallpaper off the wall, who can't organize himself out of a paper bag, who can't get his rent paid, who can't control his temper, who has sort of pathetic delusions about his parenting skills. No, that mysterious gap. But we've got to focus, unless we're talking about this business of reception, which we've just discussed, we've got to talk about what is internal to the work. It's only by looking at Picasso's canvases, not at Wikipedia, that we can say something about where Picasso was or wasn't from, or what he is or isn't of, as it were. That's the driving point, that it's constitutive, right? It's internal to the art production, right? And it's often possible to even say that an artist's self-description in this regard may have limited meaning if they contradict what we actually find in the canvas, on the page, on the music sheet, and so on. Thank you very much for those 2.5 of you who survived this conversation. Lots of love, and talk soon.